You're listening to Tove, a podcast about the good place and Jewish ideas. Hey, it's John Spirasavet and Elliot Goldberg. Hi, Elliot.
Hi, John. Hi, everybody.
So, a first time for season 4. You want to tell us your current state of characterness? Who are you feeling most like at this point?
I find this question gets harder and harder with each season, not because of the show, just because of the distance from my original watching. Like, to prepare for this episode, I had to go back and watch 4 episodes to get back into it. And some of the characters aren't quite who they seem to be.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know. I think this has been my answer. I still want to live in Jason's shoes because he just has such an interesting take on the world.
This is a good Jason episode that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. I'm finding myself more and more interested in the Janet character, who is becoming more complex and more, there was a way she was emotionless, and the character still has there's emotional depth emerging, and I like that. And she's assuming, she's bought in to this work that, our friends are doing to try to better existence or the universe. And it strikes me as artificial intelligence. She might not care, but she cares, which is intriguing to me. I don't know that makes me want to be like her, but it makes me think about, what it's like to be in it right now.
All right. So you said you would like to be more like Jason yet.
Yeah.
That made me, and you're feeling sort of Janet-like in this artificially intelligent way.
Sure. I mean, it's the time of artificial intelligence, right? There's been new big developments since we were last on the podcast.
Yes.
You could do a whole podcast from that chat the artificial intelligence thing. Just type in Jewish podcast about the Good Place season 4 episode, whatever, and see what it does.
I wonder if there are any events where Darcy Carden has been invited to either speak as Janet or as herself, or interact as Janet with an AI thing. That would be cool. We could be the first.
Interested. Yes. Yeah. I heard her on a podcast somewhere talk about being on The Good Place and being on Barry at the same time and playing totally different characters, and the differences between the groups, but nothing about AI. Maybe she has a new role to take on.
She would be the ideal podcaster about AI issues. As I've said in the last couple episodes, we are dating this podcast because some of you will be listening many years or Earth years after we publicize this, and you'll be on a spaceship traveling between 2 different star systems, and this AI stuff will seem very quaint to you. So,
yes. Right. There's spoilers in this podcast, and it's not evergreen.
I guess
which means I have to say, I've been thinking about this because since we already apologized to the future people listening, centuries from now, this is a big Jason week, because this weekend, the Jacksonville Jaguars won a playoff game and they're going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. This is a great time for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I've been sad for him, not just because he's on a pause with Janet, but when she broke up with him, she also told him that Blake Bortles was cut, which I thought was not good timing. And given that the different timeline that they're supposed to be in the afterlife, I was confused about how at that moment Blake Bortles was cut, since they're not in the traveling through time the way we are. So I was puzzled by all of that, but they're in the playoffs. So Jason, wherever you are, go Jaguars.
All right.
Sorry, I had to get that out.
That's great. All right. So we're going to plunge into a Good Place episode. So Elliot, give us a summary.
All right. I will do that. Today we're going to be talking about chapter 43, Tinker Tailor Demon Spy, written by Cord Jefferson and directed by Morgan Sackett. And here's the episode summary. A game of Pictionary is cut short when Janet brings Chidi's horrifyingly bad drawing of a horse to life. One of the demons, Glenn, defects from the bad place and tells Eleanor that Michael is actually the demon Vicky in a Michael suit. The group separates Michael and Glenn and interrogates each of them to get to the bottom of things. Michael admits to a few lies he had previously told. Janet's demon lie detector device causes Glenn to explode into blue goo, which will take months to come back together and reconstitute. Michael is unwilling to prove who he is by taking off his suit because he does not want the humans to see his true form, a monstrous fire squid. And he's about to point the goo device at himself to prove he's telling the truth when Jason reveals that Janet is actually the real imposter. She's actually a bad Janet who switched places earlier and has been sabotaging the experiment. Eleanor accepts Michael's selflessness as proof of his identity. Michael and Jason set off for the bad place to rescue Janet.
All right. Wow. So there's a lot of stuff to fan rabbi about here. And there were so many Janet dimensions, and actually, which probably are even more interesting given what we find out at the end about which Janet it is that we're looking at. I love when Janet is sort of like put upon, sort of, you were talking earlier about, Janet, the talking about with Brent, he's always asking for beer, and and says, I'm just glad he stopped asking me to go to dinner so we could discuss my career.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, that is so it is so creepy and hilarious at the same time.
Yes. Well, that's what his character is for, to be creepy and hilarious. It's well written, right?
And then her thing about the describing like how she's going to make the lie detector while also, they're asking her if she could do this. The Janet babies are still draining me, and I just had to put down Daisy the horse block.
Oh, yeah.
Which was exhausting emotionally and physically. And she just lays it. She fought back.
Right.
Oh,
I wonder, given what we know at the end, like she says, I'm not going to share details, and then she has to.
Yeah.
At first, you think it's Janet sort of processing this, horrifying experience that she had. But then at the end, I wonder, like, is it bad Janet trying to share gory details that she didn't have to disturb all the people and set them off? Like, it's hard to know how to read that scene, knowing what we know by the end of the episode.
Yes, it's super. Yeah. And then when bad Janet is finally bad Janet, I do like that last line. Where's the real Janet? She's in the bad place. She's probably wiping her butt with her own butt.
Yeah. It's one of the crass humor moments that the show goes through sometimes.
Yeah, it was good for that, I think. Yeah, definitely. What is it? Pig urine or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Right. How does Jason know? See, this is why he knows things. Like what alcohol goes with pig urine, and he knows which rum. Coconut rum, does he say?
Yes.
How does he know that?
Yes.
And he doesn't miss a beat. Boom. He's got the suggestion of when you're serving pig urine with alcohol. This is the perfect one. I got the biggest laugh, although partly because it was unexpected. It didn't really flow. It wasn't really, it was in the episode. It wasn't a part when Jason says he's good at solving puzzles. And then he says, I solved the word find in 30 seconds, but he's found all the words on the list of words and not in the puzzle.
That was great.
Yeah, that gave me a chuckle a little bit. That was my big one. I found in this episode, it's funny, it wasn't a major part of the plot. I don't know if it's funny, but I loved the Chidi Eleanor scene in the middle. That was my favorite piece, where he's like doing his own personal sort of self-growth about that he can't draw a horse.
Yeah.
And she knows how to take care of him while still in her role as architect. It's a sweet scene that helps them both, even though it's probably hard for Eleanor. I really like that moment. And in an episode that sort of, I don't know what it was there for. I guess the plot arc now is the demons are still trying to wreck the experiment and our friends are trying to stop them, which wasn't as compelling to me as other arcs. I like that little Chidi Eleanor moment stuck in the middle.
It was nice.
I wish there had been more of that and a little quicker on the other stuff.
Yeah, this was kind of a replay of the Kierkegaard, the Leap to Faith episode with the roast before. It was kind of a lot of the good stuff in season 4 is that kind of circling back, looping back to the stuff from before and trying to add. But yeah, I think we're in a little bit of a stretch of the season where we've got a few episodes that are there, a little more sort of plot moving. They were not written for the purpose of this podcast, although we're going to definitely make something out of it.
We're going to try.
Yeah, this line when they talk about how, I think it was about Glenn being gooified. Demons can't die. He'll slowly reform himself over a few months, passing through all the stages of demon growth: larva, slug monster, spooky little girl, teenage boy, giant ball of tongue, social media CEO, and then finally demon. It's a little bit of biting the hands who feeds you. They had a little Instagram burn, I think, also there too, where Michael's trying to justify his lies, and he talks
Oh
about
yeah,
it was an
all
inspiration.
of Instagram.
Yes, so great running into you. We should get coffee sometime.
Right.
I
That
don't know
was
if you find this. I become very self-conscious about saying to people we should get together sometime when I
because
don't
of
mean
this
it.
episode.
Well, I don't think because of this episode. I just maybe it's partly the role of the congregational rabbi, where partly you're right,
Oh,
it's impossible in the foreseeable future to get together with absolutely everybody. So I try to convey my indeed desire to see everybody with not promising to.
without committing.
I could have coffee 5 times a day with people and not fulfill that kind of commitment. So
Right. It is true. I had a coffee date once with a colleague of ours who I won't name. And we met in the morning. Went to their shul, went to the morning service to Shacharit, and we had coffee after. But I discovered then, well, they said, I'm not really a coffee drinker, but I went out and bought you the Starbucks, the instant packs and made a cup of coffee to me and for me. I just remember my takeaway was saying, we could have had tea. It wasn't about the coffee.
yeah,
We made coffee because like we wanted
literally
to
coffee.
connect and spend some time together. Like you didn't need to make it an errand. You could have hosted tea or even water. Like I'm here for you, not coffee.
I don't know. There's something about coffee. Yeah, it stands for. It's not.
Right. They
It's
took
great.
my invitation to coffee was taken very literally by my friend and colleague who became, host of the event, who didn't drink coffee or have any in his office. So you do have to be careful about that.
Yes, yes. See,
Yeah,
it's so fraught to just talk about having coffee is such a
it
fraught,
is.
fraught
Yes.
offer. I have to say this was funny at the beginning in the Pictionary game about Mariah Carey's lower back butterfly tattoo, and then that should have gotten that sooner. I wrote my college thesis on that back tattoo, and it was making me think about how the one idea I had that I've like seriously thought about sending to Saturday Night Live was I thought a game of Pictionary where the contestants are all like expressionists like Picasso and
Yeah.
Kandinsky, and where you just see all these scribbles and they say like angst, ennui, and that's the extent of it. I wanted to pass that along to the writers, so
Nice. Maybe
now
they're
I'll have to do
listening.
that. That's right. There's some crossover. Make
Right.
sure you
But
used
don't
to
prompt.
write for Saturday Night
Right.
Live.
All right. Maybe. But when you meet them, don't invite them. Don't part by saying, let's have coffee sometime because you might not.
Yeah, on so many levels, that could go off the rails.
Yeah. I was struck by that list, Michael's list of like the stages of demon growth. Because it seemed like, was he implying that social media executives are demons, like in human costumes, and they've infected Earth? Because it's a stage of their development. Like every demon has to spend a time to human in this role. I found a lot of things in this episode were written for the laugh or to move the plot forward. Like I had questions about like the timeline. Like, is this real? Like, Janet's been talking since the beginning of the season about how hard it is to run this neighborhood.
Hmm.
But then Janet's gone and it's bad Janet who's running it for her and trying to mess it up. And she gets handcuffed and like taken out. And then the neighborhood doesn't fall apart.
Yes, which is what I want to loop
Like,
back
how's it
to.
happen? How's it keep happening?
Yes. Well, actually, that's, if you don't mind, I think I want to sort of start there. So I know this will sound a little left fieldy, maybe. When the podcast began, I really thought, ethics is about ethics, and there's plenty to talk about in terms of tshuva and the process of doing that, and kind of the microscope around all that, those processes of returning and repairing oneself and all of that. And I didn't think that the podcast would ever deal with theology at all. And I guess conveniently forgetting that we've got Michael and Janet and then Sean and all these demons. So we have these kind of eternal beings around. And, that exact thing that you're saying, Elliot, sort of got me to thinking about this, that we really do have, right? Michael is essentially detained, and Janet is, certainly put upon, and then they realize, as you're saying, that she's not really there. But the humans do not seem to think the whole thing is going to collapse. And we've seen the neighborhood implode on itself when they left in season 2 and all that kind of stuff, or when Eleanor had her crisis in the void, and not only did she dissolve, but like everything around, even the void itself started to dissolve. But here things kind of go. So it made me think of this issue, which is kind of captured in this statement that appears a couple places, one of which is in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It is Chagiga 1:7 for those keeping score and looking up. And it is a statement by Rabbi Chia bar Abba. And he grabs a verse from the prophet Amos, and he says, God says, basically, I'll give in on the fact that people abandon me as long as they keep my Torah. For if they abandon me and keep my Torah, the leavening in it would bring them closer to me. So it's always been an interesting idea, I think, that I've been drawn to, that the theology is maybe not the grounding of the ethics or even the practice or the learning of Judaism, and you could detach God from that picture and still have the Torah, or still have Judaism. But I think that's a question that people have, like, is ethics possible without that kind of grounding? I was taught by my teacher, Earl Schwartz, in Talmud Torah, who I've referred to actually back at the beginning. He mentioned one of the dialogues of Plato, where the question gets asked, is the good good because the gods choose it, or do the gods choose the good because it's good? And I think we do have these traditions that, some parts of our Torah say you do this stuff because I'm God and I said to do it, and others say these laws that I have, they're wise kind of inherently, and they happen to be the laws that I'm choosing to teach you. But here I think we have this case where the people are like, they're like, okay, at the moment, if they think Michael is the best thing they've got going from the eternal being set, being deprived of him, they don't say, oh my God, this whole thing, like they think they can save it themselves. They think they can do this on their own.
Right. They're latching on without, right. If it is Vicky and the Michael suit, they're going to figure out a way to go on without him.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like at any point in this stage they're really contemplating that. Like, I know that they say, like, the whole thing could get ruined, or, at the end of this 1 year, we could all be condemned to the bad place forever. Right. But this episode did not have the feel like that was a real possibility. Like, it didn't seem like a threat that was hovering over them. They were dealing with like a situation, and they were at least somewhat, they were maybe not comfortable, but they were okay turning the tables on Michael and interrogating
right.
Michael. Yeah.
Right.
And Michael humbling himself, I guess.
Right. Well, it was a serious threat to the experiment, but it wasn't like the whole universe was going to fall apart. It's interesting, as you were talking about that source from the Yerushalmi, which I really like. I thought about it not in terms of the ethical rules, but in terms of like spiritual existence. That God's saying, if you forget about me, that's okay, because the leavening in the Torah, or if you remember the Torah and you live by it, you'll come. We'll come back. We'll rise up. We'll meet again. And it makes me think a little bit. We're just past the time when we're having this conversation, just past the 50th yahrzeit of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who talked a lot about how the structures we build sometimes make God distant and we don't notice. And what Judaism's there for is to make us sensitive to the divine in this world. And as long as we have Judaism, I think might be his read of this text, that we'll come back and connect back with God, because Judaism helps point us the way to notice where God is present in our life.
It's now interesting that now that you say that what Michael's willing to do, which is to point the goo maker at himself, will not actually destroy himself, but will like disintegrate himself. But then, but there will be some period of time where he will get reintegrated.
Right. But maybe shorter if we miss some of the goo.
Maybe shorter.
Be a little shorter.
Yeah. Right. But that's, so now I'm thinking that what he's saying is like, I also, since Michael knows he's Michael, I could disappear and you'd be deprived of me for some period of time, but during that time I would start to, come together again. I mean, that's literally what happens to the goo. It gets, as long as you put it all in one container.
Well, Michael also says, you could do this without me.
Yeah.
And some of this makes me feel, we do have these eternal creatures who sometimes are like divine creatures, But I think there's an episode, I can't remember, where Jason actually says, well, you're God, right?
Yeah.
But there's a way
And
in
there's one
which,
I think in the previous one where where Eleanor is suffering over Chidi's, well, torturing Chidi about stuff, and he
yeah,
comes back with this situation, and she bursts into tears, and he says, "Oh my God, I made God cry."
oh yeah, yes, that was a touching moment. But it makes me think, though, in this scenario, like the theology of the show, there's a way in which the divine entities are more like the pantheon of like Greek gods.
Mhm.
There's not one God. There are different gods with different, there's the God of justice, who's the judge. And then there's I don't know, the God of the bad place, who's more like an administrator of the bad
Yeah.
place.
Yes.
But there are these different entities with different tasks and different skills and different passions that are also running amok. And that, I don't see pulling, jumping off the screen, parallels to, the Greek pantheon of gods, but there's a way in which there's a pantheon of good, bad, and middle place overseers who are in their own existence with their own drama and their own concerns. And that reminds me of Greek mythology more than, I don't know, Jewish theology.
Yeah, yeah, I could see that. I think what's happened in the arc, of 3+ seasons here is that we have a moral philosopher acting with this group of people and sort of teaching them some concepts, and we have Michael, who's a demon, did of course bought into none of that before, thought the whole thing was a joke, and then like learned it from humans essentially, and there's this nice sort of handing off back and forth, which I think is something of what happens in Jewish theology, where I think we say that the divine kind of hands off the world to us, but our work with it sort of enhances God. And I think in this
Yeah,
particular statement, of Rabbi Chia, where I was trying to figure out, because I really hadn't ever noticed it before, where he talks about the leavening in the Torah, which suggests this image of something that's in the process of being created into something more tasty.
right,
When it's farther from God, I guess, is what could be in some way, it could be almost beneficial for the people to take a step away from that. And now, of course, in this episode, the step away is like very temporary. It takes place over whatever that afternoon is.
right.
But it did get me to wondering, and I've often tried to, when thinking about Jewish ethics and why Jewish ethics is it distinct at all, it could either be distinct because there's God involved as a source, or it could be distinct because the Torah is some kind of mechanism for doing that. And I just have never read an argument that convinces me that says that God is necessary, that a divine commander is necessary, or divine author of these laws is in a literal sense, is the way that it has to be. So I've always really been drawn to this teaching, and I think it's what makes me like the way the Michael and Janet are portrayed, is that they don't ever walk around, or not after the first season, as though the universe kind of is in their hands entirely, or even that these people's destiny, where they pretty quickly
Hmm.
realize, they don't have control over these people's destiny, and these people can make decisions about right and wrong, and that are sometimes more real than what the gods, so to speak, can do.
Right. Well, Michael said this recently, where he says to Eleanor, like, you guys figured me, I had this whole plan and you guys figured me out in 3 months and then you did it 800 more times.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, that's the piece of like the humans rose above, you know, that's the echo of the Tanur Shalach story where like God says, my children have overcome me, right? The rabbis out logic God in this story, and God is defeated. And there's a way in which Michael said that. But I wonder, in this episode, I'm struck by, there was a Glenn moment. Glenn has come to the other side, and he rides on the hand powered train with a good demon cloak. The symbolism to throw you off, that was the
yeah,
cliffhanger, right?
yeah,
Who's
yeah.
this person? But it's not, like, Glenn is the second of the demons to have a moment of, wait, the system could be wrong, and if the system's wrong, I don't want to play my part in it anymore. He could justify being the penis reinflator to allow for re-torture. I think that's his job.
Yes.
He can justify that because on moral grounds the people who they're torturing deserve it, and he's beginning to question the reality, which causes him to go to the other side. And there's the moral dilemma that these divine beings are having. Like they're starting to question the reality of the systems that they have, which has been an arc in the plot, for the last season and a half or so, I think. But now we have another demon who's taking that seriously and saying, I'm jumping ship or I'm jumping train.
Jumping.
I'm jumping train and I'm gonna go, I'm standing on moral ground here where I'm gonna go reveal the sabotage to Michael and friends and risk everything to do that because I can't justify my behavior anymore. That's a real ethical decision he makes that brings him to this place.
I had the feeling that Glenn was also a ruse. I mean, it sounds like the way you're presenting it, Glenn has overheard what we will learn shortly to be true, which is the Vicky in a Michael suit. That's a thing that's coming up in the next episode, I guess. And so presumably Glenn's aware. I guess. Well, we know that Glenn is aware of that, but does he think that this Michael is the Michael in the suit, or is this, like he just happens to be wrong about which Michael he's looking at?
Right.
Or is this another part of the messing up that, the chaos, if they hadn't figured out, or if Jason of all people hadn't figured out about the Janet thing, they would have succeeded in getting, Glenn would have succeeded essentially in getting Michael to, blow himself
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
And then that could have potentially been an issue or,
Right.
yeah.
That's a great question. I do remember there's a good joke when Glenn reconstitutes himself and returns, but I don't remember what stance he takes. I remember like he's back and like they make a joke out of it. I don't know, 3 months later, I don't know how many episodes it is, but I don't remember if he switched teams. I think he comes back after everybody switches teams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we
But it's,
don't know. We might never know if Glenn is legit or just another Sean sabotage effort to sow despair and disunity. Ooh.
yeah. Yeah.
When Michael Schur is on, you'll have to ask him.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it is. I mean, again, and I'm probably stretching this too far for this purpose, but in that sense, Glenn, represents a bit of a pernicious thing, which is that if Glenn, who's attempting to be a voice of, okay, this is how things are actually going now, it's sort of pernicious. When it takes a special demon like Michael's play is to essentially to invest in the humans and subordinate himself, and even as he says, lie. He even made up the lie, according to him, he made up the lie about being in a nervous breakdown over the situation just to get Eleanor to do things. If that was, machination, like that was a good one. Either way, that plays nicely. And Glenn sort of would represent this idea that the gods are so in control they can even sort of continue to take charge and sort of dictate the terms. And what am I trying to say? And I mean, no, that's a mess. No, I don't really have it.
All right. See, Glenn stifled you. We just don't know.
Yeah. And I want to love Glenn because he gets so much, dumped on him.
Yeah. Well, what I do, there are these vignettes where we look at some of the demons, or right, some of the demons have their moment where you get to see their character a little bit. And sometimes I think like that the demon world, it feels like Monsters Incorporated to me. Like there are all these different monsters and they're different from us and they're working in a different universe and they have jobs like that, and some of them are endearing. When we see the demon world, right? When Sean's not around,
Yeah.
it's not always evil, especially Glenn gives that perspective. Like I thought I was just doing my job. There are bad people and they're here to be punished and makes sense.
I guess I was thinking is that Glenn is not endearing, and even though you definitely would rather, take his side than Sean, Sean who's so mean. But yeah, if Glenn represents sort of a lukewarm way for the, supreme being to kind of put themselves at the foundation of what the ethical foundation is. And that's not a good one either. And I think that there are some attempts to kind of theologize ethics that are just not appealing. They're lukewarm. I don't know. I mean, you and I are probably sort of similar in this, is that we perhaps sort of back engineer our divinity concepts a little bit to fit with what we think the divine human balance should be. And once you're away from the idea that God is the self-sufficient source of what makes something ethically good or bad, then a Michael-ish kind of God is an appealing figure if you're going to have some eternal, something that's more eternal than us who vanish.
Yeah. Well, for me, a long time ago, stepped away from the notion that there's a personal God, that God's an entity, that's an individual, because I believe in a God that's much more abstract.
Mm.
Therefore, like for me, in terms of ethics, which you raised, most of the ethics in Judaism are universal ethics. And sometimes in the particulars or in the details, Judaism falls in a different place, in the complex scenario from other traditions and cultures. But I think Jewish ethics resonate with other cultures' ethics and are part of it's one of the universalist elements of Judaism, where the particular elements of Judaism for me are our rituals, our culture, our way of life, which is different. And those aren't Shabbat, keeping kosher. Those things aren't ethical choices for me. They're spiritual choices. The
Mm.
ethical choices, I think we share much more with other faith traditions. So then some of them are in our sacred text. They're in the Torah, but that doesn't make them, or one version of them from several millennia ago are recorded in the Torah.
Mm.
They've developed since then, and while there's a way that in our sacred text they feel like ours, but when you get down to the core of those ethics and what it means to be ethical, I think we're more like everybody else.
Mm. So I like how you said that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So you were bringing another lens on this and the question of how they're going to deal with this uncertainty over Michael.
Yes. So I thought where we have this dilemma, Michael and Glenn are presenting different plausible truths about what's going on. And Eleanor, who's in charge, and everybody else, I guess, too, they have to decide. And it made me think of the biblical story about Solomon the king that's become a famous, right? It's moved from the Bible to folklore even, right? Solomon, the wise king, who's confronted by two women, each claiming that a baby is theirs. And they want him to adjudicate, like, who should have the baby. And he listens to each of them and he proclaims, well, I can't decide whose it is, so we're going to cut the baby in half and you'll each get half because that seems fair. And so one of the women says, no, don't do that. She can have the baby. And Solomon awards the baby to the woman who protested his judgment because only the mother would give up their child in order to see it survive. So that's the biblical tale. And there were echoes of that. The context is different, right? But
Yeah.
There's the notion of, Michael's willingness to self-sacrifice with the goo gun is the determiner for Ellen. Jason has to puzzle out the Janet thing a little more. Jason is like the Sherlock Holmes here,
Yeah.
more than the Solomon. But some of the scenario that they're facing, like Solomon's is, right? They're in a tough, they have two people telling different versions of the truth. And there is no access to some all-knowing divine entity that can rule, right? The decision is left in human hands, I guess, with Janet's advice, if they ask her, and they have no way to tell, and they have to figure out how do we think this through. And now Eleanor's not Solomon, neither is Jason, but sort of in their own ways, they each have to puzzle through what they've seen to try to reach a conclusion about who to believe, who's telling the truth, how do we move forward. And some of that is imperfect. I mean, even imperfect so that we said processing it, we don't even know if Glenn's telling the truth or, right, is he an honest character or is he dishonest but telling the story to sow further, discontent. So we're puzzled like they are. I don't know, there was something about how Michael's willing to self-sacrifice, led Eleanor to say, oh, no, now I know. Echoed for me that Solomon story. So
Yeah, I really love that frame because I think it, as you say, they have lots of information from the past. I mean, the first time in season 2 they had to make their leap of faith in Michael. Eleanor was sort of proposing, I think, evidence for this, and along with a bit of, he just seems like the kind of guy who would be there for us. And against that backdrop, I was sort of like, wow, she's really grilling him. Like, she's not willing to say, well, because I guess they've been giving this alternative theory. Maybe it's not Michael. So the difference is,
yeah,
I guess in that issue, it was, has Michael changed back? And here it's we don't even know whether we've got Michael in front of us
right,
at all. And when he essentially proves that he is Michael. So in that sense, Jason's move, sort of deprived us of an interesting
right.
what would have happened. That it's a sort of like Michael's pushing them all through the portal in the bad place and staying
Oh yeah.
behind. Yeah, yeah, which is a move
But I
that
think
makes
Michael
pretty
brings
much
it
sense.
up. Like I mentioned some of these before. I spent this episode with questions about continuity and without the Janet, how does this neighborhood keep functioning? I had a series of these questions that like, wait, this isn't gelling for me in terms of the
Yeah.
timeline. So I get to the end of the episode, Janet's in handcuffs, and it's as if like, right, there wasn't the soundtrack, but I felt like, the music came on the end, we're about to end happy. And I was like, wait, we still don't know if it's Michael or not.
Mm.
And then before it's over, Michael says, wait, you still don't know if it's really me.
Oh yeah.
And for me, it was like, I thought that was powerful because, well, one, I'm glad the show didn't end before that because that would have, I wouldn't have been
Yeah.
happy if the whole plot was, is it Michael or not? And then at the end, we just forget about it.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
but everyone was so focused on Janet and, Jason's realization that they didn't bring that up, but Michael put it back on the table. Like, and that was his moment of, authentic honesty or radical honesty. He's like, okay, this is good that we discovered that we have the wrong Janet, but that doesn't solve your problem that you don't know if I'm me or not. And like,
Hmm.
oh, that's like, to me, that's also like the mother saying, I'll give up my claim on the baby. Like Michael
Hmm.
saying, I, I'm not willing to let you forget the fact that you're not sure if you can trust me or not. I thought that was a
Hmm.
powerful move at the end.
Yeah, yeah, it is. The last time I taught the Solomon story that you're giving us to adults, I thought this is supposed to be the indication, the proof that he's such a wise king, that he came up, or that he was a wise person, that he came up with a solution when, as you say, he didn't have any other evidence. So he basically went to midot, to virtues and qualities, and he tested instead of testing the evidence, he tested their character, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I thought, but is this all that brilliant? Like, wouldn't anybody have come up with that? And
No, that's more generous than me. I always
yeah.
think like Solomon's like a buffoon. Like he does get to build the temple, but he's not my favorite biblical character. Like I don't find a lot to love of Solomon. And I have these moments of thinking, maybe he meant that. Maybe like this was an accident. Maybe he was stuck and he thought, well, I can't decide, so I'll give each half. That sounds fair. And he didn't think it through. And luckily one of the women stepped forward to say, no, don't do that. And he stumbled into this solution as if like there's no evidence to say he thought about this from the beginning.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't always read him so generously that like, maybe he's a buffoon of a king and this just turned out well. And then because he's Solomon, it gets in the Tanakh and then we love him for it. But like, really, I don't really like this story or any of its implications
Yeah, I guess
or
that's true. And
characters.
yeah, and Eleanor we like better. At least this version of Eleanor that we have,
Yes.
it's not a
But she
buffoon.
embraces the buffoony part of hers.
Yes, that's true. That's
She
true.
doesn't hide it.
Yeah. But she does turn it is interesting because we've talked about how, recent Michael will have these moments of being a tall older male, kind of mentor to sort of gently position himself in Eleanor's presence and sort of give her wise advice. But and as you're saying, she can do that to Chidi, but here's a place where she goes to Michael and says, that's the most Michael thing you can do. So that's
Yeah.
that's redeeming. And it's interesting because I think a lot of times now our dilemma is that in a lot of public life, particularly where we have people who we have thought about as admirable, and then we're confronted with evidence that they are not as admirable or they do bad things. And, usually if you're already disposed to think that someone has, good qualities and virtues, you'll want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And so I like in the sense that the show doesn't assume that you can do that because sadly we've been burned by that. You can't
Yeah.
you can't assume that kind of truth and virtue always go together. There was a lot of nuance I thought in this particular thing. Eleanor
Yeah.
did not have the answer, right? She did not get to the answer on her own at all.
Right. Well,
And
she trusts in Michael acting like Michael. There's proof in like he does a Michael-ish thing that Vicky couldn't have done.
yes, yes, unless this was diabolical Vicky knowing that they would never let him actually point the thing at him, like that could have
Right.
been a
Well,
game,
keep
a
going.
chicken, a very high, you know.
Right.
because I mean, Glenn is, I mean, I mean, being turned into blue goo is better than being unzipped into a flaming, monster. And
Right. Well, that also made me question, did Bad Janet, she said she made the gun as a truth teller.
hmm,
That's why I think you can believe Glenn. She said this gun is a lie detector,
hmm,
but it turned out to be a demon gooifier.
hmm,
And I think the Bad Janet gooified Glenn because he's not part of the sabotage.
yeah,
She wants to take him off that it didn't malfunction, that's what it was supposed to do, because Glenn was undermining her ability to be the bad Janet,
hmm,
or to be the good Janet, whatever, to being bad Janet being the good Janet who's trying to destroy the experiment.
yeah. When we talk about the different ethical philosophies, and we deal sometimes in the realm of assessing facts as they are, and sometimes working on what do we know about the character of the people around, and who are involved. And this is a nice move to say. But what they've been doing is they've been conducting an investigation of, do they have enough evidence, and even does the fact that Michael's admission of his lies impugn his character. And I think we've well established once again that he's a complicated, he's a person of good, or not a person, he's a being of good intentions who doesn't have a spotless record, who's manipulative,
Right.
for good purposes. And how do you make a judgment about that? And again, I think Jewish ethics is not extremist about that. There are going to be situations where you encounter each other as being overall good, but the bad things that happen don't. So that's kind of that dilemma
Yeah.
too with
Well, our characters, the Tanakh
the Bible.
is full of flawed characters. The Talmud is too. We don't have heroes who are pure. We have people who do heroic things,
Mm.
and sometimes in the next chapter they do awful things.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the problem. Yeah, in this situation, it's not just a question of getting out of this moment. Okay, the experiment isn't ruined, but they need Michael still to be Michael. They need him for the future.
Yeah.
Also, it's. I was thinking when you introduced this before we got on about this teaching of in Pirkei Avot that I think we've probably talked about the idea of judging people with a positive bias, putting your dan l'chaf if you sort of imagine the scales of judgment, if they're balanced, to decide to judge someone more favorably. And our friend Maimonides, in his commentary on this, says basically, but you start with an assumption. If you have a well-established, a well-founded belief that a person is good or a person is evil, then you can legitimately take that into account in terms of what's going on. If you encounter someone who you have thought of and has proven themselves to be good, and you see them do a bad thing, you can definitely question, you can definitely ask whether the one bad thing is just an aberration.
Yeah.
But if you see someone who you've thought of as, been bad, and they do one good thing, and this in a sense is Glenn, the fact that they seem to be doing a good thing, judging them favorably doesn't mean that you erase that whole past bit.
Yeah,
And
that's fair. I
yeah.
never thought about that with Glenn.
And no, I've sort of puzzled on that a bit as to whether that would that be considered favorable judgment? The second one doesn't sound like favorable. It sounds like, be cautious, trust but verify. And
Right. What makes
um,
me think of too, I almost said Michael McDonald, but he's from the Doobie Brothers. I meant Malcolm McDowell, the author. Like he wrote Blink, which was about trust your gut.
Gladwell, Malcolm Gladwell. That's who you meant
Oh,
to say.
sorry. Malcolm McDowell's the actor. So we got Doobie Brothers. We got, thank you,
A
Malcolm
lot of
Gladwell.
Malcolms, yeah.
A lot of Malcolms, which may or may not be edited out of this podcast. Malcolm Gladwell in Blink, I'm oversimplifying. It's not the simple, but it says trust your gut. Sometimes your snap judgments, your first instinct about people you should go with. And then the other side of that is he wrote about after in Talking to Strangers, which is about sometimes when we rely on our gut and our predisposing inclinations, things go awry. And like lots of things are wrong in our society because of unexamined biases that come from our gut. I guess the postmodern world that we find ourselves in today, we're re-examining things that we as a civilization, like Western civilizations, thought we could determine about what's good, what's bad, how you judge people, how you don't judge people. Like the fact, the ways in which we're discovering there are biases in the system that are so deep that they affect individuals. And, when we think we're not biased, we're much more biased than we are. Like a lot of the complexities about judgment and judging are not as simple as we thought. And some of them modern people like Malcolm
Mm.
Gladwell is writing about. I think it's changing the conversation. And some of the texts we used to go to while nice and familiar, might not be the ones in which we're going to find the answers because we're entering a new way of thinking about this.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that even the Good Place neighborhood, which is such a simplified version of reality, is where these kinds of nuances come into play. Like we really don't know about Glenn. There's enough, and again,
Right.
clearly about Michael. And it's interesting because I was thinking about this idea of judging favorably. We've talked about the Brent character as being somehow a little bit drawn from the news story about Justice Kavanaugh before his confirmation, and a lot of people are like, this guy's been he's been a mentor to women and his clerks and done, this and that good thing. It's not, can't we just assume that that's the story and not the stuff that he's been accused of doing when he was a young adult? And so it's really hard to apply these
Yeah.
judgment filters because what we really wanted was to know for sure, and we don't know for sure. And I think that what's I think tugging on me right now, this has come up before, and I know that this is not in the intentions of the writers at all, but the idea that the only way you can prove your goodness, like in a crunch when there's uncertainty, is through self-sacrifice, is that's the only move that can really prove your goodness. That seems problematic, and I think that some would say that that seems like a Christian thing. There's so much corruption in the world that even the divine will sacrifice God's self. Like that's the ultimate act of kind of truth and loyalty. And I know that they're not pushing Christianity, through this show, but it seems like we're not given in this universe a proof that's short of that. Somebody has to be willing to
Right.
destroy themselves. And that's what Michael has done, or that's when we talk about Chidi. Like you have to go to extremes. And short of that, we're in this realm where you can't make, shaded judgments. And that rubs me, as too simple and also as like that's actually is not a helpful way to resolve this question of judging in
Right.
uncertainty.
Right. The notion that what you do when your back is up against the wall is what you're judged on, as opposed to, your entire body of work or your day to day.
Mhm.
Although the show has exploded the flaws with, right? The flaw of counting counting points based on everything you do every moment doesn't work because it's hard to make the rules right so that the
Mhm.
points work out right. But you're pointing out also, it can't just be that under pressure, because sometimes, right, there are plenty of stories about like someone's good, untested, and makes a really hard and questionable decision in not normal circumstances under a lot of pressure, which I don't know, ruins them or doesn't, or whatever,
Yeah.
it depends
Yeah.
on what the literature says. But sometimes the argument there is you can't judge a person by what they do in those tough moments because those aren't normal moments.
Mhm.
You're,
Yeah.
you're not in balance. You're not you. Your brain is fine. Your body and your brain are giving you all these messages. You're in danger, and you might do something you regret later because you're not fully in control.
Mhm.
Whereas,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
not what this show is saying. In those,
Yeah, yeah. Usually not. Yeah,
you know,
and I think in your Solomon story, I guess the mother, the true mother, does say, "Fine, I will entirely 100% renounce this baby if that's what it takes to
yeah,
save its life." So that goes against the way that I presented this as only a Christian inflected kind of thing. But if the mother in that story had said, "Okay, fine, let's not cut the baby in half. Let's find a third neutral mother,
oh yeah,
to take it," that wouldn't have seemed as maybe not as satisfying in a narrative sense.
right. Well, I always wonder what would happen if neither woman spoke up. Would they have killed the baby?
Mm,
Like that's like, was he really going to go through with it? Because they could both say he's not going to do it.
yeah, yeah.
Like he's not going to do it. Like let's just wait. We'll have to have a retrial. Yeah.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
think this is an interesting moment there, and I think that if I were to unify the couple of threads that we've talked about, right, even making judgment, even humans making judgment about God, saying good or bad is not really a binary thing, and I think in Judaism that works. There's not a neat tidy package for that, and then an ethical coherence doesn't depend on there being that.
yeah, that's true. So we've dealt with some theology and some ethics. I just thought I don't want to let this moment go because there's also a little bit about aesthetics in this
Hmm.
episode that maybe belonged on my list of things that made me chuckle. But in the middle there, in that Eleanor Chidi scene, Eleanor, while she's channeling Michael or she's channeling an architect when she's, she's not just being her, she's being the architect. And she says, the best things humans ever invented were nachos. And Chidi says, well, that's not true. She's like, well, what's better? He's like, the Sistine Chapel. And she says, no, that's just paint on a ceiling. Like nachos, those are good. And that's a good bit. But had there not been so much about ethics in this episode, I wonder there's a lot about aesthetics there. Like, are nachos more aesthetically pleasing? Is that a better invention? Because of, we all have access to nachos, but we don't all have access to the Sistine Chapel. Like, assuming we accept those two and we can compare them, I think they're, and we can get through the silliness of that moment. I think they raised a good aesthetic question too about like, what's a worthy creation? What's good in the aesthetic sense? And, if nachos giving me, I've never been to this. I've only seen pictures of the Sistine Chapel, and I've had a lot of nachos. And I can say nachos is a pretty good invention. And maybe I would, if I had to pick one, I would keep the nachos and not the Sistine Chapel because it's good. And anyways, that could be a whole other discussion for us, but I didn't want to let that one go. But since we didn't do it earlier, I left it at the end so that I leave it in the hands of the editor. If you want to close on this note or leave it on the floor of the
Well, actually,
digital
no,
editor.
it's good because we've talked it. We're gonna put together somehow among us an episode about food and the good place and food and tshuva. And there've been so many kind of lush parties and chowder fountains and nacho, but all of it, and even this is, yeah, nachos in a whole other category. So I'll have to put that in there,
Oh,
comfort food and
nice.
yeah. So all right, that's a great seed.
Nice. There's some good guests who are in the Jewish ethics and food space. If you really want to do
Yeah,
a show,
who are you thinking of?
well, anybody at Mazon
Hmm.
or Chazon, all the zones.
I was actually thinking of like foodiness, like gathering. I don't know.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a whole number of Jewish foodies and cookbook writers, right? If you want to go for that, there's the ethics and the aesthetics.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Cool.
There you go.
All right, Elliot, great to talk to you.
It's nice to be here. I just recently added to the snippet of my bio the occasional co-host of the Tove podcast. So, because I am an occasional so like I feel like it's good to be here. But now I feel like you said in the first one, where I said thanks for having me. You said, "Oh no, this is our thing." I was
Yeah.
like, "No, I was here once," but like, no, I've been back. So I feel that communitarian spirit about this is our. I mean, it wouldn't have happened without you, but I'm glad to be a regular presence in the other chair.
And I'm going to say the opposite of let's have coffee, which is let's do another podcast soon. And I'm going to
No.
mean it. And I mean
I thought you were going to say, I never want to talk to you again.
All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon. Bye.
All right.
And so we conclude another episode of Tove, and thank you for listening. We've got show notes for this episode and other general resources related to Jewish ethical vocabulary and texts at tovegoodplace.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, subscribe and give us a good rating, and tell people about it who love the Good Place with your own word of mouth or by social media. Ours is at Tove Good Place, and we'd love to hear from you there or by email, tove@tovegoodplace.com. You can get Elliot Goldberg's pieces on the Daily Talmud page at myjewishlearning.com. Click on the Daf Yomi link at the very top of the page. And you can follow him on Twitter at Elliot_Goldberg. I'm John Spirasavet, rabbijohn.net, and at RabbiJS3. And check out my home base, Beth Abraham in New Hampshire, tbanashua.org. Thanks again for making time for us. Now go learn more about something good.
Bum 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 bum.